Hello, good morning and welcome. Rachel Reeves has told me on the record in an interview she is considering tax rises and spending cuts in the budget in her first intervention since the Office for Budget Responsibility told her the size of the black hole. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. I've just landed in Washington ahead of the IMF and World Bank meetings on the same plane taken by the Chancellor across the pond. Talk about a doom loop, and we do. But wherever she goes, Rachel Reeves cannot escape this podcast, and Sam and Anne.
I think you can gather from that Rachel Reeves is our main story today. Prime Minister's Questions is at midday, so things might unfold then. A couple of other kind of Westminster House notices, other things in the papers. Ex-Tory Education Secretary Gavin Williamson, I mean, we love him, but wow. Angry WhatsApp messages to Boris Johnson during COVID are a sight to behold. It turns out they do all swear at each other in private and don't seem to know what they're doing. Also, more serious news, new Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood will question how secure our borders are and say that a lack of faith in borders actually undermines trust in the state.
That's a message we can expect the Home Secretary to drive home as she hosts the Western Balkans Interior Ministers meeting, a group of people very much at the sharp end when it comes to borders, policing borders, and the importance of them. But crucially, on the domestic front, Sam, we're going to hear attacks from Shabana Mahmood on Nigel Farage, by implication saying he has a unilateralist approach to the borders crises, therefore to irregular migration, and saying that instead you need to work with allies to control them. So those wars with reform are breaking out again.
I suppose there's a little bit of left hand, right hand this morning, because at the same time as Shabana Mahmood is endorsing multilateral bodies like the EU, separately today, and this is on some of the front pages, she's had a pop at the Council of Europe. Right, that's the body that oversees the European Convention of Human Rights. Senior government sources say that Shabana Mahmood took a dim view of claims made by the Council of Europe that the government's treatment of trans people in the UK and that the arrest of those supporting Palestine action could breach the European Convention on Human Rights. Right. So a little bit of one hand and the other hand. As it happens, Anne, it was the first day in the job for Shabana Mahmood's new media SPAD, so he's learning quickly about fun life in the madhouse.
Yes, because in yet more Shabana-related news, another story we should touch on is from The Guardian reporting the Home Office attempts to set up that big inquiry into grooming gangs, which Keir Starmer eventually conceded after weeks of pressure, had stalled, wrangling about its remit, difficulties finding a senior legal figure to become its chair, holding that back. And we hear that judges and lawyers were reluctant to head the inquiry, a source told the paper. Now, there have been disagreements over whether to include cases of child sexual exploitation and abuse committed by those other than street-based grooming gangs. That is a sensitive topic about not only on the remit, but about the whole approach to grooming gangs and how separate they are from other child sexual exploitation and how to address that. So it all sounds extremely tricky, sensitive, prickly, and political.
We do like to make sure on this podcast that you know everything that's relevant to the day ahead, but to be honest, that's enough Shabana news even for me, Anne. So let's turn to the main item today. Now, Anne, as you and listeners know, I've spent a lot of the last year doing pieces on the blockages to growth. You know, why just do we not seem to be able to grow fast enough? What are the problems with that? You know, at the weekend we discovered that Poland's GDP per capita is almost the same as ours. Why just can't we get things going and building? So I've managed to persuade the Chancellor to come along and talk about that in an interview for Sky News that we've just released at 6 o'clock this morning. And she was coming on to talk about an announcement to streamline the time it takes to, you know, if major projects hit the courts because of judicial review. That's the kind of announcement that the Treasury have got out this morning. But she went so much further than I was expecting. But, you know, not in a hostile way. I just, before we get into the interview proper, Anne, one of the things that struck me is just how relaxed and friendly she was, how kind of up for it she is sort of when she's not in her formal mode. We were standing, by the way, by the Lower Thames crossing. We did the interview literally next to the M25 in Kent, which is why there's so much chatting. But But listen to this, because I feel like this is we hear just a glimpse of the Rachel Reeves you get in private.
The Aarhus Convention and the Building Safety Regulator and the Bat Tunnel. And
Bat Tunnel, £100 million Bat Tunnel.
Yes, we went there, clambered through a field, put up a drone, looked at it in all its glory. Is that the word?
No.
What's the word? What's the word
Dismay.
for the Bat Tunnel? Yes.
Waste of money.
Now, it has to be said that clip makes it sound like they're the best of friends, and she is kind of witty and warm in private, but listeners of this podcast will know that I've been pretty analytically tough on her and a lot of her decisions over the last few months. I'm just interested on your view of her as a person before we get into the substance. She's very friendly and professional. And in this interview, look, fair dues to her, she's very candid. What is your experience of her as a person?
Well, she was on friendly, conversable mode when I bumped into her. She was a few rows ahead of me on the plane to Washington. I think usually, as you point out, she's someone who can separate the big argument about the economy and the blame game that is fought out about it, and there's going to be some more, and we're going to hear why in just a moment, more from you. She can usually separate that from good relations, and she's pretty chatty. She's looking forward to the spring meetings. She's had her team around her. She looked very relaxed when I saw her too, and as you point out, with you, I mean, she sounded very engaged, like she liked being out and about. If you can like being out and about with next to the Dartford tunnel with the traffic roaring past you, that's the stuff of raw politics, isn't it? You've got to like that. If you don't like that, you don't like the game of politics. I do think she's also in fight back mode. We've seen relatively little of her out and about since the summer. So it's great that you got hold of her, because when that bill, the welfare bill, was effectively defanged at the behest of Labour backbenchers, that clearly knocked her. Fighting on the economy is a hard road to hoe these days, but you can tell by her tone with you, she likes something to fight about. She's a pugnacious politician. So the question is, where does she want to take that fight?
Let's see. I feel like there were sort of three news lines in this interview that I want to get your view on, Anne. And the first one is very stark, and it's her saying something that bluntly she has not said before about this budget. Let's hear it.
You agreed, yes, there are tax rises coming down the track.
I was really clear during the general election campaign, and we discussed this many times, that I would always make sure that the numbers add up. And of course, challenges are being thrown our way, but I won't duck those challenges. Of course, we're looking at tax and spending as well, but the numbers will always add up with me as Chancellor.
Extraordinary how candid she was there, saying that to make good on her promises, keeping to that fiscal discipline message that's come under a lot of fire, also on her own side, she was sticking to that. So that's one clear thing. And that she was going to look at tax and spending, she said there in your clip. But the message was clear. Tax rises are coming. There is going to be an almighty row about why that is happening and whether it is to do with her management of the economy or noises off and things that were happening before, other things that were happening, if you like, in the Dartford tunnel of politics and the economy. But here's the really interesting point. We have that claim no tax rises would be made on working people when she came in as Chancellor. Because she says she's sticking to her fiscal rules, who are they going to fall on? How will the definition be shifted so that she can make the tax rises, which sound to me like they're going to be more than just scrabbling around in a few pension pots?
It's worth just going through the background. In the manifesto, Labour committed itself to about £8 billion of tax rises. In the budget last year, Labour put up taxes by about £40 billion. In the CBI conference a few weeks after the budget, Rachel Reeves said that there would be no more tax rises in this parliament. She clarified that later to say there'd be no more tax rises on that scale in this parliament. She stuck to her commitment that there'll be no tax rises on working people, but the black hole, we believe, is in the 20 to 30 billion pound mark, and there are going to have to be pretty substantial tax rises now. She has spent weeks sidestepping the T word. I listened to an interview she gave a couple of weeks ago, and however hard the interviewer pressed her, she just wouldn't use the T word. Now, we have expected tax rises to come in the budget. So on one level, it's not a surprise, but this formalises the right of all of us to speculate what they are. And over the next 6 weeks, don't worry, we will. And we weren't expecting spending cuts to be part of the mix. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, because cabinet ministers' 3-year Whitehall budget, spending settlements have been fixed. They were fixed in the spending review before the summer. So, no cabinet minister I spoke to at Labour conference was expecting them to be sort of pared back at all. Welfare, well, nobody I spoke to thought that they would be able to get substantial welfare changes over the line in time for the November budget because they're complex and the politics is quite clearly absolutely agonising for the Labour Party. There is a little bit of a suggestion in the ether that she tweaks budgets in the third year of the spending plan, but that will feel a little bit like funny money and nobody would believe that technique. The markets wouldn't believe that if she tries that. So I'm not quite sure where this, I was surprised by the spending cuts statement, and I think cabinet ministers will be unnerved and they won't be able to ask her in cabinet this morning because she's not there. And another thing I was surprised about in this interview was that she actually engaged with me in a conversation about the doom loop. Now, if you remember, she's borrowing so close to her limit, she's having to keep coming back for more tax. How are you going to break out of that cycle? I asked her. And she actually answered the question.
Nobody wants that cycle to end more than I do, Sam. That's why that is why we're putting all the effort into growing our economy, because that in the end is what brings in the tax revenues to be able to afford to keep taxes low.
Can you say the end of the doom loop will be this year will put an end to the doom loop?
Well, I'm not sure if I would use those words, because our economy in the first half of this year was the strongest growing economy in the G7.
That was a heroic attempt getting the words doom loop close to the Chancellor, Sam. And as you say, although she said at the end she wouldn't use them directly, she had admitted there in your clip that she did want to get out of this. So this taxes up, spending down, inflation on the march. So effectively, she did seem to be saying, I feel as if I'm in a doom loop here, and I understand that. And of course, that is an attack line, a mighty one for her many opponents here. Looking at the context, as she has arrived here in Washington among a phalanx of rather worried-looking finance ministers. Germany's Lars Klingbeil arrived at the airport just a little after Rachel Reeves. I happen to know because I got stuck in the global entry queue. Also, with this inflation, this target on his back, as Rachel Reeves has on hers, about UK inflation rising. Now, that's something, if you talk about a doom loop, that really brings it back to front and center of the argument. I was overall surprised that she is clearly now just pitch rolling with you so candidly about the tax rises. Let's not forget that. That seems to be the major thing, that there's no more havering, equivocating about that. So the question is, where are they going to fall? But she is coming into Washington, where the IMF, the last time I was with her here at the spring meetings, there was a bit of a bounce. It was all, oh, well, Donald Trump's a bit reckless with the American economy. Let's hope that doesn't go wrong. The blame was all going in this economic and financial sort of superclass of people who hang around at these IMF meetings. The blame was all going to Donald Trump. Now she comes with UK inflation predicted by the IMF to be 3.4% in 2025. Mr. Klingbeil can be happy that his projection is only 2.4%. So you've got quite similar economies in many ways, lots of problems with trade, with tariffs, the Trump factor, but you have quite different predictions and they're not looking good for the UK.
Price rises is what makes the population unhappy. It'll be driving those opinion poll ratings and attitudes to the Labour government down. It just does. Governments get the hit when people have to pay more for everyday life. Look, I actually appreciated the Chancellor's candour about the doom loop stuff. We went through conference not talking at all about the 20 to 30 billion pound black hole, and here she is sort of getting out there in front of this discussion. So, in fairness to her, I felt she was absolutely candid and upfront and not trying to hide anything. And I think the full marks for that. The question is, where does the blame lie? And here, the government is clearly road testing a new argument that they haven't used before about Brexit. Now, remember, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are in part in the jobs they're in because Labour got a landslide because of all the Brexit voters that backed them, right? 1 in 5 people who voted Brexit, who voted in the last year's general election, voted Labour. The landslide is in part due to Brexit voters. But now they are saying that Brexit is one of the key factors for the black hole. Listen to this.
Austerity, Brexit, and the ongoing impact of Liz Truss's mini budget, all of those things have weighed heavily on the UK economy. Already, people thought that the UK economy would be 4% smaller because of Brexit. Now, of course, we are undoing some of that damage by the deal that we did with the EU earlier this year, but there is no doubting that the impact of Brexit is severe and long-lasting.
This is going to be the political firefight to watch, isn't it? The first time now the government coming back to that theme. Brexit is the problem. The architects of Brexit, Nigel Farage, chief among them, for advocating for so long for that referendum. It's their fault. They gave Britain this referendum, and then they weren't around to sweep up afterwards, or if they did, they made a hash of it. Hence the mentions of Liz Truss there. Wow, I mean, that really is a red rag to the Brexit bull, isn't it? And you're talking here about a lot of seats that Labour particularly won, that had large Brexit constituents, and voted for Brexit, or simply had lots of their voters, as they would see them, or still like to see them, who voted for Brexit. We're testing the waters here. Do we know? We know that there is a largely metropolitan, largely like graduate professional class that's convinced itself, Sam, that given the chance, the country would vote differently if the vote were held now. But that's not the question. The question is that you're saying to people who believed in the Brexit project, who wanted to get out of the EU, that basically they made the wrong call, and that you as the government now are going to blame that. Of course, she will try, Rachel Reeves and others in the government, hard not to say it was the voters. She say it was the people who led them towards it. But then is that a false consciousness argument? One of the things that perhaps drove Brexit, as far as I could see, being in a very Brexity part of the world where I was growing up in northwest Durham, is that people were fed up with being told that they were being led by other people, and they wanted to have their own say. You then get to perhaps the more wonkish bit, which is this claim, and Rachel Reeves is leaning on it, that the OBR, with that projection that the UK economy would lose around 4% over 15 years. So that's a reasonable amount of time, but time has clocked on. I mean, we're heading for 9 years since the referendum because of Brexit. Now, given the Eurozone problems, which we've touched on, given the global problems, given the pandemic, given tariffs, etc., it still feels a little bit of a stretch to be so sure that this was such a big reason why the economy is in trouble. Clearly, it's a massive contributor, but I think she's going to come under quite a lot of strain to explain that. Even the OBR seem to have ever so slightly nuanced their position. I won't hold us up reading out what they now say, but they say they're keeping an eye on it because times have changed and facts have changed. Broadly, they stick to it, but it's a big figure to have to pin your argument to.
Couldn't agree more. Potentially blaming your own voters is quite a move. Listen, Anne, I know in the final few seconds of this podcast, you want to raise one other very quick topic as we bust over our time, and this is on China. Just tell us very quickly what's going on.
Yes, I felt we shouldn't get to the end of the podcast today, Sam, without touching on that failed China spies trial, who was to blame for that. And Playbook reporting this morning that the row is deepening between the Crown Prosecution Service, which formerly employed as its boss one, Keir Starmer, and the deep state in Whitehall and Number 10. Government officials obviously getting pretty weary of firefighting on this. I'm pretty sure also that Kemi Badenoch will go for a sustained grilling on this case at PMQs, although she's also got your great tax bombshell story to go on too. And this is really the suspicion that Labour dropped that intended trial, even though the evidence against two men had been gathered to appease Beijing, because it wants to tap China as a source of economic growth. Now, we've been through it quite a lot on podcast this week. Anyone who wants to catch up could go back to that. But I think what is really changed now is that the CPS has come out basically fighting, saying we were not to blame. It's not our fault that this didn't happen. The snippy statement goes something like this. The statements provided to us for the purpose of criminal proceedings, which are now over. The material contained in them is not ours. It's a matter for the government, independently from the CPS, to decide what to do with that information. I get the feeling CPS is advocating for making it public, which would, of course, be another turn in the screw in this extraordinary story.
It certainly would. Right, I'm going to turn the screw on us because we have bust over. I just heard the alarm. Thank you very much indeed, Anne. I'm super excited that you are where the action is with Rachel Reeves. I want to know every spit and cough of how she's getting on in the morning as you head to those meetings, IMF, World Bank in Washington. Look forward to speaking to you tomorrow.
See you in the morning.